Hey everyone, you are halfway across the world from me. Really excited to get to be a part of this, excited to be extended this invitation. I know a couple of the people that I think that you all know. I know Alex Absalom. He was actually one of the very first people to coach me 12 or 13 years ago as we were planting a church and we were using Missional Communities as the launching pad for that. And then you also know, I believe, a guy named Rich Robinson, who I'm really good friends with and do a lot of work with here in the United States and in Europe. My name is Doug Paul, and I am in Richmond, Virginia, here in the United States. And for those of you who are not really sure where that is about 90 minutes south of Washington, D.C., here on the East Coast. So that's where I'm at. Sort of the two places that I spend a lot of my time is I'm a local church pastor, and so we are in the inner city of Richmond, Virginia, and it is the place where about I think it's the sixth highest concentration of poverty in the United States. And so all the stuff that you would think that comes with that kind of poverty in terms of violence, in terms of addiction, in terms of like neighborhood, what that looks like. That's where I'm located. And our church is called East End Fellowship. You can visit it if you're interested. It's online. It's at eastendfellowship.org. And we have the whole mission that we've got is focused on 2 square miles of real estate. And so there is very little that we do outside of that little. It's almost like a little rectangle. Everything is focused on there. All of it, we call them house churches, but they're missional communities. They're extended families on mission that are defined by up in and out rhythms. Everything that we do is within that 2 square miles. All of our house churches are in those 2 square miles. And so that creates some really interesting things. I think sometimes we think about missional communities and they're defined by a network or they're defined by a neighborhood in terms of their mission. And we have to be defined by both, because everything that we do is in one neighborhood, everything. And so it creates some really interesting situations for us. And I'll share some stories at the end of this that we're going to do. So I'm a local church pastor, and I've been full-time doing that here in this place for a little over 4 years. And recently, I've scaled back the amount of time that I'm spending in a local church. And I'm doing a lot more work nationally and globally, helping to train leaders and pastors, doing things like this. And so I do a lot of work on missional communities, a lot of work on gospel innovation and helping people and organizations and churches come up with fresh, brand new innovation that nowhere it's never been seen before. And so we're helping them. There's a framework that we've developed that we use to help people see breakthrough with things like discipleship, leadership, mission, worship, justice, and mercy, things like that in the context that they're in. So I spend a lot of time working on that. Today, what we're going to do is we're going to spend a little bit of time, and we're going to be talking about missional communities. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to give a little bit of content, and then there's going to be a second video that we produce, and we're going to do a little bit of live Q&A on that video with some of the leaders that you all have there. And so I am going to see if I can figure out if I can do a whiteboard. Hold on one second, because I want to draw something. There it is. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to share a little bit about a principle that I've found very helpful to think about. And then we're going to unpack that a little bit. We're going to think through that a little bit. And the thing that we're going to look at is I'm going to draw a metronome. If you know anything about a metronome, hold on. There we go. It looks a little bit like this, and it's a musical instrument, or it's used for musical instruments. And what this thing does is it keeps time. And this thing right here, it's going to just keep going back and forth and back and forth. And it's got this really specific kind of rhythm and kind of cadence to it. And one way of thinking about the way that the life of a missional community functions, the way that it stays healthy and vibrant, is through thinking about the rhythms that it keeps. Now, sometimes we think about rhythms like up in and out, and we think about maybe there's a specific monthly rhythm that you use, and there are what we would call, if I'm going to write over here, we would call them predictable patterns. And so there are things that we recognize that we do that are very helpful as we think about up in and out. And so for the house churches we have, the missional communities that we have, all of them have established a pattern that everyone in the house church knows about, everyone in the missional community knows about, for up in and out. And that happens every single month that they're engaging with that. And it's very predictable. And what predictability does is it creates a kind of security, and it creates a kind of safety for people. It allows them, by predicting what's going to happen within what we call spiritual family life, it allows them to really get a sense of what their place is, how they can form their world around this, and all that kind of stuff. But the thing that you're going to notice is, for like an established missional community, is that after a while that can get somewhat stale. And so what you really want to think about for the way that a vibrant spiritual family can really function over time is, while you do have things like predictable patterns, you are also, if I can get this thing to move, it's not going to let me do it. So let me try this here, is that you want to have what I'm going to call a chaotic push. And this is what I mean by that. A lot of the time, and most of the time, you think about the metronome swinging back and forth, that arm of the metronome, most of the time, is going to be spent on predictable patterns. But every once in a while, and I would say maybe every 15 to 18 months, you want to see that arm swing over into what I call a chaotic push. And that is where you ask the core people in that missional community to do something that is going to require a lot of focused energy. It's going to require them to do a lot of reorganizing their entire life for a short burst of energy, for a short period of time. It is not sustainable that you would do this for the long haul, but there is something that happens when you do this together. So one way of thinking about this chaotic push is, if any of you have ever been on a short-term mission trip, one of the things that you know, I'm going to do a stop share. One of the things that you know is you can take a group of people who have never met each other, who have never spent a lot of time together, and they go away for a week, or they go away for 2 weeks, and they go to a different country, they go to a different region or a different part of the country that you're in, and they spend 2 weeks or a week just doing everything together and experiencing everything together and having this intense pressurized experience together. And those people come back, and suddenly it's like they're best friends. And it's like, well, you didn't even know each other. How did you become best friends overnight, like seemingly overnight? And this is what when we think about family on mission, a critical piece of forming a family on mission is this recognition that this thing is formed within sort of like the intense experiences within the fires of mission together. But oftentimes those things happen in an intense period of time. So we sometimes this happens, we see when intense grieving experiences happen, but there are ways that you can make this happen. So I'll give you an example. I was leading a missional community at another church where I was one of the pastors leading this really large church in Florida. And I had a missional community that I was leading, and we had an experiment. We had a group of people. There were not many people. We started with probably 6 or 7 people who wanted to do this, and we asked the question, what would happen if this group of people met every single night for house church, for like a missional community experience for 40 straight days. And so that's what we did. We had 6 or 7 people, and we had rhythms of up in and out, but all of those rhythms were happening within a context where we met every single night together from 6 o'clock to 8 o'clock every single night for 40 days. Now, in order to do that, you have to completely reorganize your life. And so we had a group of people that were willing to reorganize their life for those 40 days to try to see what would happen when that happened. And it was extraordinary. I mean, like, I actually remember after it was sort of like a weird group of people. They didn't know each other very well. It was not a group of people that had a lot in common. There was, if I'm honest, there was one family that I probably didn't want to be part of it. I didn't have natural chemistry with them. I felt they were they're kind of weird and out there. And I remember sitting after the first night, my wife and I are talking in bed, and I'm just thinking, is there any way to get out of this now? Like, we're on day 1. We have 39 days to go. I really don't want to do this. But we kept at it. And so we went 40 straight days in that chaotic push. So we've in the past had predictable weekly patterns, and then we moved the metronome to this chaotic push. And it was astonishing to see what happened when we moved into this one short period where we had a burst of frenetic energy, and it was very focused. And that thing, the number of things that we learned was pretty extraordinary in that period of time. But we also saw a lot of things happen as we saw more and more people start to become part of it. And in ways that we couldn't have predicted. We saw people come to faith who we didn't even know. Like, we didn't have relationships with those people. It was just because we were keeping rhythms of up in and out and doing it in an intense period of time. We saw a burst of fruit that was happening as well. There's a principle, there's a sociological principle, and it's called bright spots. And the idea is this: when you do one of these chaotic pushes, the thing that you are looking for is what's called a bright spot. And so the story for this is, I think it was 1991, there was a doctor who was invited to come to Vietnam, and he was with the World Health Organization. And Vietnam was experiencing a major health crisis as there was an epidemic of malnutrition that was happening within Vietnam. And the government had invited this doctor and his team to come, which was really surprising. He was surprised that he was invited to do that. He comes in. He's picked up at the airport, and at the airport, the person who picks him up was like, "Hey, I just need you to know, you were invited to come here, but no one really wants you here other than the person who invited you. And you're going to have to prove something very fast. You are, in fact, going to have to fix the health crisis in 6 months, and you have virtually no budget to do that. And you don't have any equipment. And you're like, I don't know how you're going to do this, but you're going to have to do this." So this is, for them, this is an example of like the chaotic burst. They have a very specific time frame. There's 6 months for them to solve a nutrition crisis in a whole country. And so what they decided to do is, rather than exploring the problem, because they just didn't have time for that, they didn't have money for that, they wanted to explore solutions. And so what they did is they took their team and they went to different villages where the nutrition crisis was the worst in Vietnam. And what he instructed his team to do was to say, what I want you to do is to pinpoint, to identify families where there is like where there is a kind of health that is different than everyone else in the village, where you have a family who is perfectly healthy and we don't know why. And so what they did is they spread out and they went to these different villages, almost 2 by 2. And in each of the villages, they identified the places where there was one family who is exceptionally healthy. And then what they did is they went into it and they're like, okay, what's going on here? What's different? Why is this thing working? How is this family healthy and everyone else is sick and dying? And what they found is that in this one particular thing, there are a couple of reasons that this family was always experiencing health. And it was the same thing that seemed random in every single village. And what they called this was a bright spot. It was something that in the midst of everything else that's not working, by having a focused amount of time, you're able to see in the midst of the darkness, there's one pinpoint of light, and push into the light rather than focusing on all the things that aren't working. And what that chaotic push does, what that fixed timeline, where you're going to do something that is actually unreasonable. You're going to ask people to do something that's unreasonable. You're going to do something that's unreasonable for a short amount of time. What you will discover are some bright spots. And you're going to be able to locate those. You're going to be able to see those. And you're going to be able to build off of those for the future as the metronome flips back to predictable rhythms. But now when you're thinking about these predictable patterns that you have, you're going to be able to use the insights that you got from this burst of chaos and bring that and be like, okay, we noticed that God is doing something here. We learned something here. There's a new practice that we learned here that we're going to bring over to this thing over here. Now, for you all, you probably have two different kinds of missional communities. You probably have ones that are just starting, and the ones that are starting might not even have what you would say is like that extended family size of at least 15 people. And so you might have 6 people who are like the nucleus of that missional community. What I would really advise you to do is to start with that chaotic push. Start with those 6 people and push into something that feels unreasonable. Like that 40 days is a good example of that. I'm not saying that you need to do exactly what it is that we did, but something that feels wholly unreasonable, where people are forced to reorganize their life because of what it is that you're asking them to do. And then as you do that for that fixed timeline, look for bright spots and see what fruit the Lord brings from that particular push that you do. Now, for older missional communities, for ones that you have established predictable patterns, the thing that you need to do if you are looking for fresh energy, if you're looking for fresh vision, if you're looking to multiply, is to move from those predictable patterns and invite that group of people into something that has that kind of unreasonable request, where you're asking for that chaotic push, and see what the Lord brings out of that time. You don't know what the Lord's going to bring out of it. You don't know what fresh vision the Lord is going to lay on someone's hearts, because you don't know what experiences people are going to have yet and what the Lord is going to say out of that. And so if you're trying to think like, what's a way that we could multiply, or what's a way that we could recapture some fresh missional energy and imagination and vision for a new season, it isn't going to be from like locking yourself into a closet and really trying to like think of every idea. Try something, put yourself in a liminal space, put yourself on the edges of the missional frontier in an almost unreasonable way, and see how the Lord meets you in that place and how he speaks to you in that place. And then let that experience and that fresh word, that fresh bread, inform the vision for that established missional community that you already have. I want to give 2 extra things. So that's the big principle, that metronome principle. I want to give you 2 other things that I think could be helpful, that are just maybe some tactical things. So let's go back to the whiteboard. Let me erase this real quick. Let me go back to drawing. And so you all are familiar, of course, with up in and out. So we've got this triangle over here. So we've got, that's just ugly. I wish I could just erase that. Hold on a second. So we have up. You would be surprised how difficult it is to draw with this thing. In, and then we've got out. And these are the core rhythms. These are the core practices that we have as a spiritual family on mission together. Now, if you're a smaller missional community, the thing that you have an opportunity to do, like if you've got 6 people or 8 people, and like we don't have the size to really have that center of gravity. The thing that we do with our missional communities that's been very helpful is to have them orbit into another missional community once a month. And so when one of our missional communities multiplies, rather than saying, all right, you're on your own, it's over, what we invite them to do is to form a tribe. And so it's to say, hey, even if you're multiplying with 20 people or 15 people or whatever it is, like, what if we once a month come back together? And so what that does, what we do is they're actually attached right here. And so one time a month, we have 2 missional communities now that will get together, and we have a group of people that we've trained to lead what we call house church worship nights. And so we now have, instead of like 20 or 25 people together, we might now have 30 people who are together because we have a smaller missional community that's launched, or we have 2 larger missional communities. We might have 50 people, and they might meet in a different space. And one time a month, they come together, and they are reminded that there's more than just their missional community. There are actually 2 missional communities that have come together. And their orbit, their predictable pattern, includes joining up with another missional community. Now, if you're a smaller missional community, this is exceptionally helpful because it reminds you that you aren't alone. It reminds you that you are someone who is part of something that's bigger, and it allows you to get some momentum. It allows you to share a little bit in that other setting of what the vision of your missional community is, and it keeps it in front of another missional community because there might be some people that start to feel drawn to that particular thing. Now, we join once a month for house church worship nights. For you might be someone who wants to do that around out, or you might want to do that around in. You might just want to do a meal together and a game night or something like that. But I really would encourage you all, like, if you're in a small missional community, have a predictable pattern, have a monthly rhythm that orbits into something that's bigger than yourself. So that's one tactical thing. The last thing that I will give you that we're starting to ask our missional communities in our local church, and then even in some of the things that I'm doing nationally and over in Europe, is to have this be a real assessment question for your missional community. And it's this: how are things materially better for people who are part of your missional community? Here's what I mean by that. When you read Acts 2 and 3 and 4, the thing that you see is that for the people who were part of a house church, it says that in Acts 2, it talks about how every day they met in Solomon's colonnade. So it's like a giant shed outside of the temple where thousands of people could meet. So they got this large gathering setting. And every day they met in their homes. So they have this house church gathering that's happening. In that house church setting, it says that there is not a single needy person among them. That there's this belief that all things were shared in common. And so for people who were in a house church, it was materially better. It was physically better for them to be in it than to be outside of it. Now, sometimes we think about these missional communities as a way of helping people meet like spiritual needs, and they do, or emotional needs, as we think about things like self-actualization. That's really helpful. But it also should be meeting some real physical needs that people have. And so one of the things that you should really be thinking about as an assessment question, I would encourage you maybe after this video to maybe spend some time talking or thinking about this, is in your missional community, why is it better for people to be part of it materially? So in our place, we're in a place where there's a lot of poverty. And so one of the things that we talk about is we have some major issues in our neighborhood that we don't have, like, culturally answers to. As a society, we don't have answers to. So in our neighborhood, there's a lot of addiction. In our neighborhood, there's a housing crisis. There's a lot of homelessness. In our neighborhood, we have a major educational crisis. The schools in our neighborhood are awful. In our neighborhood, we have a major issue with employment. A lot of people who are unemployed, who are unable to even pay the electricity and housing that the government is providing for them. In our neighborhood, there is a major issue around transportation. And all of the jobs are in places in the counties that are outside of the city. The only way to get to those jobs is to have a car to get there. But the only way to get a car is to have a job to buy a car. And so you can see how, like, there's this circle. And so what we have said is, look, for For people outside of our missional community, there might be major issues of employment, major issues around education, major issues around housing, major issues around all these other things. But in every missional community, like, those aren't going to be issues, because we are committed covenantally to all of those needs being met by the people who are in this missional community. Life will be better here. So, like, in our missional community, every child is going to get a good education. And so we're committed to figuring that out. And so right now in our church, every child is getting a good education. Outside of our church, that is not the case, but inside of it, it is the case. For some people, that's because we've created like tutoring scenarios. For some people, we've created the ability where people are helping people get into private schools. For some people, that is their homeschooling, their co-ops that are forming around that. It's not a single solution. It's lots of different solutions that are happening. It is better for people to be in our missional communities than outside of it materially. So for you, where you're at, what does that look like? What does it look like for people to have their material needs met in such a substantial way that it would be worse for them to be outside of your missional community than inside of it? If you look at Rodney Stark, who's a religious sociologist, and he wrote a book called The Rise of Christianity in the 90s. It's actually, he wasn't a Christian when he wrote it. He became a Christian by writing it. And his question was, like, how did the church grow so fast? And one of the main things that he points out is this thing here, is that it was better for people in the early church to be part of this part of the church than outside of it. Like, outside of it, people died a lot faster. Outside of it, people were hungry. Outside of it, there are all these physical issues, material issues that people had, but inside of it, it was different. And there was such a stark difference. What does that stark difference look like for people inside of your missional community versus people who are outside and choosing not to be part of that missional community? So I would encourage you to have some conversation around that. Last, I just want to share two stories, stories from the front lines here in Richmond, Virginia, of things that are happening here. One is we've got a house church that is meeting, and they had a person who was a person of peace for them. And one of the things that had happened is she didn't know why she was coming around. She was relationally connected to someone. She had heard about this missional community that was happening. She just started to pop in, and she didn't know why. She was not a Christian. She was actually an atheist, and she was, she was in a house church that was made up of, it's really diverse in both racially and economically. It's got people who had been in prison. It's got people who are doctors, people who are architects. This is someone who's a medical student. And she's an atheist, and one of her reasons for that was science disproves the existence of God, but she kept coming to something that was a very Jesus-centered experience. And she witnessed someone getting healed. And she kept asking questions about this. And a couple of weeks later, she became a Christian. And the very next week, when they were together, there was an opportunity for someone to receive prayer because they were sick. And the person, they asked if anyone wanted to pray, and the person who volunteered to pray for this person was the person who had just become a Christian the week before. And so this person comes up, and she places a hand on her, she prays for her, and that person was instantly healed. I say this to encourage you that the God who put the stars into the sky, his spirit is alive and well today, and his spirit is in you. Like, we know what Paul says, the same spirit that raised Christ Jesus from the dead is now alive in you today. And that spirit is activated the moment someone is moved from spiritual death to spiritual life. And so I want to encourage you. I want to encourage you that spirit is in you, that spirit is not dead, that spirit is not missing, and to push into all of the places that spirit is taking you, that you would find the places where God is at work, and that you would join him in that place. I hope some of the content I've shared has been helpful. I want to commend you in the work that you're doing. I'm really excited to do a little bit of question and answer that you're going to see in just a little while, and we'll see you soon. Bye.